Everyone to this session of the South Asian Studies Colloquium, and briefly introduce those of us who are here on the panel. I guess my name is Sivaramakrishnan. I'm a professor of anthropology in the School of the Environment, and I will be briefly introducing our visiting speaker, Dr. Khorakiwala. And then she will make her presentation. And after that, my colleague, Anthony Akiavati from the School of Architecture here at Yale will make a brief comment and then moderate further discussion and questions from the audience. So that's the plan. So let's get started. It's a pleasure to welcome Ateya Khorakiwala to Yale. I have this recollection that we invited her once before. I think it was to agrarian studies, and some very important personal business got in the way for getting here. So I'm glad she's able to join us today as a guest of the South Asian Studies Colloquium. Currently, Ateya Khorakiwala is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia University. She is by training an architectural historian and has worked on what is very fascinating to me, the infrastructural environment and the landscapes of development in India, with an interest especially in the built environment and the kinds of construction materials that went into building those infrastructures of development. She's working on a book project that investigates the plinth as an interface between infrastructure and architecture in development post-World War II India. And she's also working on other projects, a volume called Systems in the South, Architecture in Development, which is to be an edited collection. Prior to joining Columbia, Ateya Khorakiwala was the postdoctoral fellow at the Princeton Mellon Initiative in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities. And of course, before that, she got her PhD at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. She obtained her earlier and first architecture degree from Mumbai University's Institute, Kamala Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture. So without further delay, let me again welcome Ateya and invite you to make your presentation. And after that, it'll be, Anthony will take over and lead us through the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Shivi. Let me share my slides. Oh, sorry, I'll get to the beginning. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to share my work here at the Yale Colloquium today. Before I elaborate on buffers, I wanted to share this piece of found poetry from the EPW. Do we dare to ask the purpose behind such impressive stockpiling of grains, since it is not being used to pump prime and slash the ruling market prices of food grains? Has the buffer been built purely for the sake of form, for quenching the inner thirst for poetry in some hearts? I'm sort of throwing you a bit into the deep end here, but I'll come back to this piece of found poetry at the other end of this talk so that you can see it again with more context. What I want to point out here is that buffer stock finds itself in 1972 in this paradoxical situation where it can neither fulfill its economic function of lowering market prices, nor can it fulfill its ontological function of providing nourishment. Then all it is left with is its monumental and aesthetic function. And that interests the architectural historian and me. For the sake of form, can we historicize this form? Can we read economics as poetry? So with that opening salvo, let me turn to the work of getting to this point. In India, between 1940 and 1975, politicians and experts came together to forge a technocratic system to manage and distribute food in the name of securing the body politic of the state from hunger and famine. what came to be known as food security, this very biopolitical term. These policies transformed both countryside and city. Taking this hypothesis that the built environment was transformed by food policy, my research proposes a different framework with which to analyze the post-colonial built environment and the category of Indian architectural modernism, which is this: that famine, food shortages, and hunger undergird Indian modernism. The country's architectural and aesthetic modernism is also a biotechnological modernity. Wheat and rice are embedded in and entangled in the aesthetic and formal procedures and techniques of South Asian modernism. To flesh out this claim a little more, the 19th and 20th centuries in South Asia were marked by famine. Not only famine in its widespread and monstrous form that was evident in the Bengal famine of 1943, but also small pockets of hunger and starvation that rippled across various districts through the decades prior. The famine code, drafted in 1880 under the Viceroy Lord Lytton, was written to intervene in these moments of starvation that gripped peasant societies at regular intervals. One piece of the code mandated that public works projects be instituted to extract labor from and provide in exchange the means of food purchase to peasants. In this way, at least, there is a direct connection between the technopolitics of hunger and the colonial landscape. We see the legacy of this public works imagination in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, dating to 2008, that guarantees 100 days of employment on public works projects. So here in this image, you see the intersection between food and landscape that has its roots in the moral and biopolitical calculus of the 1880 famine code. In the 1940s, outside of catastrophic famine, India also faced food shortages in the more mathematical sense, that the amount of food grain produced within the boundaries didn't match the amount needed for consumption. Famine became shorthand for food shortages in general, and vice versa. But also because food grain had to be imported from abroad, largely from the US, but also from other countries, and paid for with costly foreign exchange, famine became a synecdoche of the larger scarcity of resources that plagued the country. So my point here is that the Indian government inherited a condition of food management that amalgamated three things: famine threat, population management, and a threat to a legitimate sovereignty. And all of these forces get crystallized in the form of the silo. Food storage emerged as a key political technology with which to manage and display the political economy of food and hunger. By 1975, storage conceptually evolved from piecemeal interventions into of rented and owned godowns, warehouses, to a large system of procurement and distribution that dovetailed with emerging epistemologies like statistics, logistics, cybernetics, and programming. Storage systems also referenced moral concepts like self-sufficiency and political ideas like sovereignty. So, consider these two images. The watercolor to the left shows the Golghar, a structure built in 1786 in response to famine in Bihar. So this is where these two structures are, and in Bihar and in Delhi. The image on the right is the May 1975 cover of the Indian Concrete Journal. And on the cover is a concrete wheat storage silo built in the 1970s. Both storage systems lie empty. The one on the left was never filled, and the one on the right, just some 40 years after it was built, is now cracked and obsolete. So what is it about these two structures, separated by 200 years, different construction technologies, and different political economies, that have brought them to the same condition of obsolescence? One of the major famines under British rule took place in Bihar in 1770. 10 million people died, a third of the population. Warren Hastings, Governor General of Bengal in the aftermath of the famine, commissioned a granary from the architect John Garston, who had designed administrative buildings in Calcutta. Two staircases, and you can see them here in this image on the right. I guess I don't have access to my mouse. You can see them, yeah, on the right, spiraled up to the top along the outermost skin of the structure, the Golghar. Laborers were to carry sacks of grain up the 142 steps, pour grain through the structure, through the hole in the top, which you can then see in the section on the left, and descend down the second set of stairs, which you can see both sets of stairs in this image on the right. The granary, however, was never inaugurated and filled. Why? Why build this granary and never fill it? A few reasons float about in the literature. The stairs were too steep. The doors opened inwards in the wrong direction. Here, architecture is the proximate cause of failure. However, it was closer to the truth that Hastings, at the end of his career, when the granary was near completion, lacked the political and economic power to build the requisite number of structures, and more so to redirect grain from the market into storage for protection against famine. And so here we end up with this empty monument, ornamental, so to speak, a tourist site in Patna today, even as Hastings himself was shipped back to England to squander his wealth on defending himself from impeachment over the next decade. Edmund Burke impeached Hastings over his having usurped too much power, too much sovereign power in India from none other than God himself. Hastings' claim on sovereignty was undone by recalcitrant grain. So empty silos are hardly unfamiliar to us. World over, abandoned silos are being repurposed as canvases for art or as spectacular architectural projects, coinciding with the deindustrialization of cities. However, there is an irony in this, because for modern architects, primary among them Le Corbusier, the silo was this perfect incarnation of form, function, and monumentality. When Le Corbusier wrote Towards an Architecture, an image from which is on the right, he used an image of a silo taken from an essay by the Bauhaus modernist Walter Gropius. Neither the German Gropius nor the Swiss Le Corbusier had seen an American silo in actuality. The German architect Erich Mendelsohn was the first to see and photograph silos. The caption under Mendelsohn's image of the silo on the left will give you a sense of the European obsession with American silos. To Le Corbusier, the silo embodied the principle of logical and rational aesthetic production that was central to modern industrial architecture. And so there is an irony to the silo itself becoming ornamental to the city as an industrial ruin and a functionless form that acts as a container for some other symbolic meaning. Both of these, empty silos, where in Patna and in Delhi, where even empty silos carry the memory of abundance, of excess, of bounty. You see them and you don't presume that they are empty. Storage became emblematic of biotechnological modernity. And what I'm trying to also sort of argue is that storage drew from this long history of modernist aesthetics to impart a sense of newness to the ancient object that is grain. Storage has entangled governmentality and citizenship, claims to the government as well. And so take this case of this farmer Gurdeep Singh in Ranvan, who was quoted in the New York Times report in 2012. So this essay was written in the wake of a bumper crop, when the intensive agricultural industrialization has resulted in a bumper crop. There's this sort of story being reported. So that's a kind of contradiction here that we're going to investigate, that I want to investigate as well. This article on the failure of systems of distribution in India concludes with a quote from a farmer, Gurdeep Singh, in Ranvan in Punjab. "It is painful to watch," said Gurdeep Singh, a farmer from near Ranvan, who recently sold his wheat harvest to the government. The government is big and powerful. It should be able to put up a shed to store this crop. A shed. And the word that Singh probably used here is go down. This basic infrastructural object for Singh signified the government and the state, an infrastructure of storage. At first glance, Singh's missing shed signals an absence of shelter, a primordial hut, the originary architectural gesture of a refuge to protect grain from rotting in the sun and rain. However, while the absent architectural object echoes the antediluvian hut that is allegedly the essence of all architecture, it embodies instead a modern technique of political economy. And this modern technique of political economy is buffer stock. Post-independence India was fixated on this idea of buffer stock. What is this? Buffer stock is a significantly large quantity of grain, and in the 1960s, it was it was calculated to be 5 million tons of wheat. There were also buffers with other commodities, but here I'm really primarily focused on wheat. A buffer stock is a significantly large quantity of grain held in reserve by a centralized administration that would allow its holder to correct any imbalances in the market price of the commodity. If prices rise, you release stocks and flood the market to lower the price. And if prices drop, you absorb grain to raise the price again. An integral part of this system are floor and ceiling prices. What are these architectural metaphors doing here in this economic concept? Floors and ceilings, I think, something to do with this, open up a gap within a market that allows us space for manipulation. They represent the role of the state within a market. So, but this leads me to one of the questions that I'm interested in my research, which is, what are the ways in which architecture and economics are relying on each other, materially and metaphorically? So where this metaphorical story is about opening up room for managing uncertainty. The material story is about the politics of display and monumentality within the biopolitical regime of food security. In its obsession with creating this buffer, the state was determined to become a hoarder, although a benevolent hoarder, which in its command of territory and policy could out-hoard all other middlemen, and thus secure the market from fluctuation, and in turn, the country from catastrophic failure. And here, this is a reference to hoarding being central to how the Bengal famine played out. But while the tools of price management are abstract, their guarantee, which is the wheat reserve, this buffer stock, is physical, volumetric, corporeal, and need I say it is alive. This tangible and biological nature of grain complicated its own theoretical model. After all, how and where do you store so much wheat? Storage emerged as a key political technology of democracy and of post-independence sovereignty. Because of this, obsession with buffer stock, the storage of food became a nationally inflected engineering issue. As Dr. Kasad points out in his presidential address in 1958, the shortage of food grain and their import from different countries of the world has set the government yet another problem. Their storage has been satisfactorily solved by the barrel shell type of design for grain godowns, warehouses. The Food and Agriculture Ministry is planning their construction. The barrel shell type has advantages of better flexibility, better lighting, and possibility of reducing space required. Besides this, the new design is expected to save a colossal amount of structural steel. The Central Building Research Institute has started a special course for training engineers in the technique of designing it, end quote. So somehow concrete shell roof construction achieves a status that was usually reserved for dams and factories. And this is because of the value accorded to buffer stock. Early attempts to build both storage and create this buffer stock remained continually behind schedule as the country struggled to meet production and procurement targets, supplementing shortages with American grain. In contrast to India's difficulties in the post-war years, the United States faced gluts in its agricultural sector that threatened to destroy their farmers. During the Cold War, the Eisenhower administration repackaged US surplus grain as foreign aid in the form of Public Law 480, a food for peace program that doubled in its use as a tool of diplomacy in their Cold War arsenal, enabling them to influence the Third World against the Second. Thus, in the 1950s, India began receiving large shipments of wheat, living ship to mouth. A key legislative detail was that surplus agricultural commodities could be sold to India in foreign currency, which would then be reinvested into India for developmental purposes. So that is that India would pay for food aid in rupees rather than in dollars. And this law gave fillip to organizations like Rockefeller and Ford, who could channel experts into India and pay for projects with the US's idle rupee reserves. So to help India acquire this political technology of storage, the US gave the country a number of prefabricated storage structures, two of which were iconic silos made of galvanized steel. Thus, in 1955, 14 ships arrived at Indian ports carrying a disassembled gift from the US government. Small 2-meter by 2-meter, durable, lightweight sheets of galvanized steel, a kit of parts to be bolted together into two 10,000-ton capacity silos to be installed on poured concrete foundations anywhere in India. Although the resulting storage was crucial, the gifted silo mostly functioned as a symbolic object. Bureaucrats debated its actual necessity, given that its capacity was only a fraction of the 1.5 million tons of imported grain circulated per year, an even smaller fraction of the aimed 5 million ton buffer stock. They relegated it to Hapur, a town east of New Delhi that was arguably a waning center of agricultural production. Constructing this behemoth was complicated. Land had to be acquired from farmers. Scarce cement for the foundations had to be sourced, and American experts had to be hosted on the storage department's dime and ferried to and fro from the site on continually delayed schedules. Yet, for all its shortcomings, the silo became a model project for the storage department and its ministry, which is the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. The immediate challenge to replicate this model experiment was in Maharashtra and in Bengal, in Bombay, in Borivali, and in Kalyani, inland from Calcutta. So where the Hapur silo was at a mandi, at a market, the other two were planned for port-related storage, where bagging grain coming off ships was a major time sink and an expense. The storage department officials, the storage department archives document an official, Ghosh, slowly lowering his expectations from the model Hapur project to the Borivali grain bins that are sometimes still called silos. This was what was possible on the construction front. Throughout the 1950s, the technologically and formally modernist silo remained an architectural import, and Indian engineers worked on their own version of storage architecture. In the meantime, the publicity and propaganda machine that was the Indian Concrete Journal was pumping out its technical specifications on barrel shells and concrete use. A 1958 editorial, Thin Shell Concrete Roofs for Grain Godowns, analyzed the cost and consumption of steel truss warehouses versus concrete barrel shells to investigate the best options given steel scarcity faced by the country. And it concluded that it wasn't cheaper. In this image, you see a photo essay, recent examples of shell construction in India, that highlighted the use of shells for large industrial spans in spaces both government and private. Then there was L.R. Gupta's design. Gupta, an executive engineer with the Central Public Works Department, published a piece showing the process of designing centering. So this image on the right, the thing you see at the top there, that's the centering that is the wood and steel formwork for the concrete placement of the roof. This essay provided a framework for the quick construction of grain warehouses built specifically to store wheat and rice towards the stabilization of the market price of the commodity. Here, experts designed systems of storage that had flexibility to replicate and grow, and thus expand with the growing food outputs of the country. The reason centering is the focus of the essay is because it can be used over and over again. It's only economical if you build a lot of go-downs. Concrete shell roofs with their thin cross sections came to represent economy, efficiency, and flexibility in construction. And in this particular contrast to the early infrastructural intervention of the large gravity, and this is in particular contrast to the early infrastructural intervention of the large gravity dam, which harnessed the massiveness of concrete rather than its geometry, its geometric possibilities. Where the dam was iconic of increased productivity, the shell reinforced the stabilization of the market. Through storage, the Indian state hoped to manage the life of wheat, hold it in stasis, pausing its cycle of growth through technological and chemical control, to debiologize it and instead to economize it, so as to correct for errors in a possibly unstable future wheat market. The silo acted as a quantitative architecture, an instrument of calculability deployed against the monstrous incalculability of weather and market, absorbing surpluses and augmenting shortages to manipulate the value of wheat. In 1964, in an unexpected turn of events, the Prime Minister Nehru suddenly died. Lal Bahadur Shastri, the interim Prime Minister, invited Chidambaram Subramaniam to run the Ministry of Agriculture. In the years after Subramaniam took office, India suffered a 2-year drought, which led to the worst food shortages the country had faced in a decade. Complicating this situation was the powerful apocalyptic gaze of the United States. What emerged was a geopolitical narrative that predicted India's failure as a state due to catastrophic neo-Malthusian famine. In a series of influential publications, several American voices said that famine was inevitable and would lead either to a failed state or a revolution. These three factors, Nehru's death, 2 years of drought, and a Cold War apocalyptic eschatology, consolidated consent towards a technocratic turn. This enabled Subramaniam to push through a program of agricultural modernization. Among other agricultural reforms, fertilizer, credit, irrigation, which are represented in the advertisements on this slide, Subramaniam immediately moved to create a vast food grains corporation, the Food Corporation of India, that is to date one of the largest logistics bodies in Asia. However, with urgent food shortages, the food minister found himself called before the parliament. In answer to their questions about the efficacy of his policies, Subramaniam responded with a reference to the 10th century legend of King Canute, saying, "It is not as if the food minister at the center or in the state is King Canute to order the tides to recede or to advance." End quote. The story goes thus. Tired of his sycophantic courtiers, King Canute asked to be carried to the seashore, where he commanded the sea to retreat. Inevitably, the tide came in. The king turned to his courtiers and said, "Let all the world know that the power of kings is empty and worthless." The story of King Canute later, in the 12th century, transmuted from one about God's power into one about sovereignty. What power does a sovereign in fact have? And this harks back to Warren Hastings, who for as much power as he usurped could not command the earth to grow more grain. And I would argue that there's an odd dissonance in this story, because in fact Subramaniam, the food minister, is commanding the tides of food to advance. This is precisely the conceit of the biotechnological remaking of food. In contrast, the silo holds the tides of food at bay by absorbing surpluses. Embedded here is the imagination that sovereignty is nothing without food security, In securing the body, you secure the state against revolution. The term green revolution itself was a linguistic offensive against political upheaval, coined by the American William Gowd, who said, these and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the making of a new revolution. It is not a violent red revolution like that of the Soviets, nor is it a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I call it the Green Revolution. And it was this new green revolution crop that led to new management problems. For instance, how much grain should the government hold? And where should they hold it? In 1969, the Indian Society of Agricultural Economics held a seminar in Bangalore to analyze the problems of buffer stock. The problem they were facing is actually encapsulated in the cover of this text. So you see the line shows two dips, and the question that they were trying to answer is, how do you account for a shortage that is outside of the statistical range of shortages? How do you understand that statistically? So the question was, what new kinds of statistics needed to be invented to decide on the size of stocks given the uncertainty in food production? The goal of these new statistical formulations was to manage both manageable risk and unmanageable risk. Embedded in this computational seminar was a question of aesthetic judgment. How do we make decisions about an unknowable future? And what if that unknowable and abnormal future fluctuation is revolution? This buffer stock produced problems on both ends, the physical end, which I described earlier, but also on the mathematical and economic end. A.M. Khusro, one of the central theorists of buffer stock, argued that to properly understand how to manage stocks, you have to theorize stocks as cash. So he modified formulae that were usually used to determine how much cash to move and from long-term to short-term storage so that you can maximize the interest you get on that cash and minimize the fees to accommodate the peculiarities of grain. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the economic theorization of grain as cash had an effect on changing the biophysical properties of grain itself. Grain was cultivated to have low moisture and high tolerance to pests so that it could fulfill this long-term function of storage, this function of long-term storage. The question here becomes how to make grain tend towards the fungibility of cash. And as buffers expanded from being storage issues to being economic issues, the go-down started becoming more and more of a diagram. You can see the barrel shell volt make its appearance here on this cover as a line, as a diagram. And here in Khusro's essay, he represents storage as something that needs to replicate and grow, that expands with growing food outputs of the country. These buildings were described as one might anachronistically describe as code, which produce structures when deployed at specific sites. So this is a very different representation from the one we see coming out of the Indian Concrete Journal and Kassad's work. Storage begins to change in how it is represented. In that regard, this theorizing of grain as buffer stock brought new epistemologies into the picture. The December 1971 issue of the EPW published a linear programming model for determining how to manage buffer stock using Rajasthan as a test case. This linear programming model is a mathematical model that was discovered, I guess is the word, in the interwar years in the 1930s and used for logistical decision-making during World War II. And so we see the emergence of logistical thinking in grain procurement and distribution. And the ways in which food and its management in India is very much sitting on a kind of imagination of wartime of wartime logistics is another paper, like it's another part of this work. So another trendy model was cybernetics. For instance, this work of Amitav Ghoshal at the Organization Management Research Wing of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. His book, Some Aspects of Queuing and Storage Systems, proposed that under certain conditions, the queue and the inventory could be considered as isomorphic systems. Each system had something coming in, water into a dam, and the comparisons between the dam and storage and silos are replete. They keep coming up, and they're always inflected in different ways. They're not the same comparison each time. Grain into a silo, inventory into a store, and the customer into a queue. Each unit spent a certain amount of time in the storage facility or queue, and when it had finished its time there, it left. If there were no more room, the customer would leave. The dam would overflow. What made the queue interesting to Ghoshal was that the customer could gauge the queue, its length and rate of change, and decide on the best option available. The queue was a spontaneous, self-organizing system, a model of adaptive storage with a feedback loop built into it. The rules derived from it could be used to guide other systems into homeostasis, that is, to build self-regulating systems. But to depoliticize the queue is to completely misunderstand the pressures on that person waiting in that queue, as we have seen during the early days of the COVID-19 lockdowns, and as we will see in the upcoming elections. In the 1970s, the World Bank became interested in agriculture, and their studies prompted them to invest in storage. Here, storage became the point where foreign capital could find sites of tangible investment in India. This is when you see an explosion of silo building across the country in concert with the Food Corporation of India. It is here, finally, that the iconic form of the silo becomes possible in terms of quick construction through the technology of slip form. Slip form construction embodied the logic of the cylindrical form. While thin shells relied on a combination of geometry and concrete's plastic nature, slip form relied on concrete's ability to quickly gain strength and become scaffolding for itself. A ring of formwork was lifted on hydraulic jacks, and that's what you see in the second image here. Using the formed concrete below as a support for the structure as it went higher. You can also see it in that tiny image on the left, right under where it says high above the others. You can see that ring being formed as it moves up. This method became the standard for the construction of cement silos, chimneys, and various other vertical structures that required seamlessness in plan. So there shouldn't be any seams within the concrete. Slip forming migrated from infrastructure to architecture. In 1973, the cover of the Indian Concrete Journal featured another instance of slip form construction, designed by Shirish Patel and contracted to the ECC Limited, the Engineering Construction Corporation Limited, which had perfected the technique through its industrial slip forming projects over the past 2 decades. This was Charles Correa's major skyscraper project in Bombay, the Kanchenjunga project, which featured a slip-formed structural core around which duplex apartments were cantilevered. Correa's skyscraper is celebrated for how it resolves the banality of the tall building plan with his theories of climate and domesticity in section. The building is also an artifact of Correa's spatial resolution of the intersection between room and courtyard. The room open to sky, which Joseph Rickwert, architectural historian Joseph Rickwert, memorialized as an, quote, authentic modernity that superseded stale colonial imports, close quote. And he did this in Charles Correa's obituary. But contrary to the reading of Korea's work as an Indian modernism that succeeded in developing a modern Indian vocabulary, it also marks how the Indian project of late modernism to postmodernism was built on the developmental nation-state project, aesthetically, structurally, and economically. Kanchenjunga emerges at the transition from techno-modernism to World Bank capitalism, underwritten by concrete dominance, thus marking the turn from the developmental state to a neoliberal one. The barrel shell also has a similar trajectory. The shell was the prominent element in warehouse, warehouse design that then migrated into the formal language of architecture. Here you see it in its iconic shelf roof structure form, and this images of Jugal Kishore Chaudhary's roof for the IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi's Convocation Hall. Again, memorialized on the Concrete Publicity magazine, that is the Indian Concrete Journal. Here it is again. So managing silos was cumbersome, requiring huge capital outlays and skilled workers to both construct and administer them. With wheat coming in from the Green Revolution, the Food Corporation of India had to improvise. Soon they started experimenting with open air storage, first at their facility in Manmad in Maharashtra, and then later everywhere else. Thus we see the invention of cover and plinth, an indigenously invented counter to silos. CAP was low in investment, and this is what the image you're seeing right in the front of this, the silo is on the back, and that's the cracked and empty silo. I've seen the inside, it's not used for storage. CAP was low in investment, requiring a large but relatively unskilled labor force. The form manifested the horizontal expanse of storage against the vertical stacking of the silo. The plinth, with its low density polyethylene covers, hardly seems to embody the modernity of the silo, whose perfect combination of form and function, of massing and material, stood for the new industrial American agricultural economy. CAP, on the other hand, seems low-tech, but it is not. The plastic sheets were the product of new oil economies, holding in chemical insecticides, while keeping out moisture. And unlike the silo, the plinth also embodies and displays the failures of the state. And here, remember Gurdeep Singh and Ranvan asking if the government is so powerful, why can't it build a shed? Bajaj's New York Times essay represented Singh's ask for the shed as an innocent query into one of the most straightforward pieces of infrastructure, a primitive hut. But Singh's citation of the government-built godown, in fact, reveals him to be well aware of the long history of the state's deployment of sheds towards the management of monocultures and the security of the body politic. Singh, I would speculate, is much less naive about the history of storage than is Bajaj. More recently, in relation to the kind of food crisis brought on by COVID-19 in India, John Dreyes pointed out that in separating out the purchase of grain from farmers, from its sale to consumers, the Food Corporation accounts for grain using a delay. The budget allocates a food subsidy which pays for the difference between the ceiling and the floor price of grain. But this outlay is only accounted for when the grain is released from storage. This delay is in recording the money spent helps keep a significantly large debt from immediately affecting the state's credit ratings on the international market. Dreyes says, in economic terms, releasing excess stocks is costless and even saves money. But in accounting terms, it is expensive. End quote. When grain enters into this network of godowns and silos and plinths, it enters into a biological and economic limbo, a stasis which allows the management of the political economy of food. But the real work done by infrastructure and the built environment is not to shelter grain, rather to perform this sleight of hand in which it ceases to exist for some time to keep the commodity stable. So even today, as the FCI uses, photos of piles and piles of wheat to demonstrate its capacity for abundance, often the silos are empty and they are infrastructural ornaments of sort, these empty monuments that I began the talk with. And so what are these buffers for then? The unnamed author from 1972 seemed to know the answer. Has the buffer been built purely for the sake of form, for quenching the thirst for poetry in some heart? Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful.
Thank you very much, Ateya. Over to Anthony. Yes.
Let me stop my screen sharing.
Okay, there we go. Yes, thank you. That was a really wonderful talk, and it was great to see the kind of breadth of it, both in terms of time and geography. I have a lot of questions, but maybe one of the things that I'd love to hear more about with respect to the work is what seems to be almost a shift from a kind of monumental fix in a way that you're talking about that seems different than the technological fix. And I think you do a really nice job of relating that kind of monumentality, its performance from, say, from the East India Company through to post-independent India, right, with Golgar, and then with the American silos. And then your story though seems to kind of then go back to almost a kind of technological fix in a kind of peculiar way, in terms of, on the one hand, not maybe monumentalizing the object, but almost maybe a new kind of monumentality in terms of a very different kind of commons in terms of that storage and distribution. So I'd be curious to know how you kind of understand that change from monument all the way to plinth with kind of the shell structures, because you do such a wonderful job of that kind of shift in architectonics. That it would be great to hear more about that. And then I have a question about distribution. I keep thinking about how the Soviet Union, for example, right, was also importing for such a long time grains. And there was always a question of if you could just get the distribution right, meaning it was both a spatial issue as well as a kind of storage and transportation issue. I'm curious if that was at all kind of attacked in terms of its infrastructure of relating, say, silos, plinths, etc., to means of transportation, which certainly echoes back to how the British sanctioned railways as actually being an infrastructure for famine relief and shifting away from canals and other forms of water infrastructure. So I guess those two big questions shift: monumental fix, technological fix, and on the other hand, distribution. And kind of, which is I guess a way of really talking about the history of planning.
Let me start with the second one. This question of distribution. It's so what you kind of end up seeing across from the 1950s onward to onward, no end point in this story yet, is that they're trying many different things, right? In the 1940s itself, price control is the major model for keeping grain able to be distributed, so how do you make sure the market has grain? And buffer stock actually comes in as a way to decontrol. But at the same time, it never works completely. It never does what it needs to do. And so there's constantly, article after article on how, now we're putting in trading zones. So only these food is not allowed to cross from one zone to another. And it leads to these sort of strange documents in the archive where like one farmer is, talking about like moving his bullock cart from one village to another, and there's a border there. But he cannot because it's, it's this situation where that request to move to across that border ends up in a document in the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. But my point being that that distribution is, it's again not an infrastructural issue alone. It's not an issue of roads. It's also an issue of markets. It's also an issue of managing cost. There's this imagination within buffers that somehow by managing the cost, the distribution will take care of itself. I mean, and this is not to say, I mean, this is of course not to kind of sidestep the whole history of public distribution, which is its own, very, very important kind of study to that, have been done in many different fields. And it would be interesting to kind of imagine what an architectural history of the ration shop would look like. And at some point, I remember when I started this project, that's where I thought I would end up. But I ended up sort of in another place, which is looking at the ration card as a kind of biopolitical document, right? That allows you access to the system. And I think I had that one image of the queue for the ration card. The queue wasn't even for the food, it was for the card. And so distribution in this case, I think that's my point, to say that when we think of grain, we often think of it as purely in its ontological form, that here is this caloric object that needs to provide nourishment. But actually what happens is it became an economic form. And even in distribution terms, it's being constantly rewritten as an economic object, not as a caloric object. And yeah, to the other question, yeah, so this was sort of the central problem, right, that I was interested in. I was like, oh, here you have this monumental silo. What work is the monumentality of the silo doing? And I discovered that it's only doing monumental work. It's just surprising to me that they're all empty. And instead, but the other thing I also think might be the case is that the monumental work that the silo did in the United States didn't translate, like the monumentality of it didn't translate. Every time you see one of these images of grain rotting, it is also an image of a celebration of the excess. So within the kind of scarcity, there's like scarcity and excess are always dancing around each other. And in that sense, the plinth is more monumental because you see the grain. There's this kind of visual component. And, of course, we know about the stories of gold, sunhera, and that being used as a name for varieties of wheat because of that, the sort of gold being instrumentalized to talk about the value of wheat and transforming it into cash. I mean, I wish I had more images to show you because, there's so many things that they did with these rupees that the US had. They built this pavilion that had these golden domes, that then again looked like this expanse of golden domes of wheat piled, sort of alluding to an excess that wasn't even there at the time. But there's always this sort of desire for excess within that, even within all sorts of stories of scarcities.
Well, it's almost as if with the plinths and the kind of just the proliferation of them, that there's a kind of almost mosaic of monumentality, right? That starts to develop, which I think is what's also fascinating, given just also the tensions between centralization and decentralization across the nation, right?
And I mean, I know that Shivi briefly mentioned my work on the plinth in general. And so I thought maybe there's an opportunity to talk a little bit about that plinth work, which is that, the plinth comes out of the World Bank as a kind of architectural form of sites and services, right? So the plinth becomes this tool of inserting flexibility into architecture. And the narrative becomes, how do we provide a kind of architectural experience that can change over time? And that's that same imagination that's in this plinth here. And what I actually found interesting about it is that the plastic, I have this like idea that someone went home one day and used plastic to protect their roof and was like, wait a minute, I have an idea. And because what does it mean to say that this thing has been indigenously invented? You know, it comes simultaneously with shame. And, oh, you will never see anyone allow you to take a photo of the cover and plinth. You know, this is not like, take a photo of the silo, but don't take a photo of this cover and plinth. So cover and plinth is sort of this very strange object, which does a lot of the work because it also manages intraseasonal flows, right? It's not just about a buffer stock, although some plinths do also serve for storing buffer stock. So yeah, no, I mean, the plinth I found is this fascinating kind of object because the way in which I understood it was that it becomes a kind of interface between the state and the citizen, right? It becomes the point at which infrastructure erupts into architecture. It's through the plinth that you provide the toilet, you provide your electricity, you provide your services, drainage, water, and then, you know, architecture sort of sits on top of it. So architecture plugs into the plinth. And so, you know, beginning from there, I was sort of interested in this question of, can we think about the history of food, the history of modern architecture from the perspective of food? Like, what can we think of these landscapes as produced through a kind of fear of shortage and famine?
Well, and there's something about that migration also from the slip form that you're talking about that goes from an environmental control system essentially for food to its purposing by Charles Correa for housing. So,
yeah, exactly.
Right, of that kind of, you would nicely putting from that biologization to economization or economize, and then that there's another kind of shift that happens with respect to housing.
Yeah.
Took such a long time to build.
I mean, it's funny because, of course, the slip form is known for its quickness, but what I was trying to kind of think about there was very much this, like, what are the ways in which, like, technology doesn't migrate easily. It doesn't just move. And I think that was encapsulated most in the Borivali silos, bins, which really are trying to be silos, but just cannot do it. And when I was first told about it, when I was sort of looking for this material, you know, I was like, have you seen the Borivali silos? And I went there looking for silos. And I was like, where are the silos? But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's this question of how we might be able to think through the emergence of something like logistics within this story of Indian architectural modernism. Like, is that a lens that we can bring to this body of work? And so something like the Food Corporation of India becomes an interesting project in that regard. You know, that's another project that I sort of didn't talk about today in the interest of time, but that's a building that's inspired, that the architect, or rather the son of the architect, who's also an architect, you know, talks about that building as like, oh, we didn't want to do the Corbusier modernism. But instead he sort of almost just copied Giobondi's tower which is again Corbusier. And so there was a way in which when I put together this talk, I was interested in thinking about the landscape of architecture outside of Corbusier's Chandigarh. And Corbusier just keeps coming back to haunt the talk over and over again. So I always find that funny and wonder how to make sense of that. Like, even when architects themselves dismiss Corbusier, he like shows up again.
Yes, it's a bit of a whack-a-mole game, I think, with Le Corbusier, for sure. We have a question from M. Perb, who's watching on Facebook. The question is, the use of the ration card as an archive is so novel. Where did you find these ration cards?
Oh, I sadly have to say that I haven't done that yet, but I hope to one day. do that. And yeah, I mean, the few ration cards I found were like the ones that we owned. And that's where, you can sort of begin. But I think it requires a kind of ethnography. I'm sure someone has done an ethnography of ration shops. I wish I had a reference for you.
Great. Shivi, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ateya. Fascinating. So many ideas to follow up on in that presentation. What I was thinking about when we think about the silo vis-a-vis the plinth with the sacks placed on top of grain is in one case, the stored grain is sort of left to the viewer's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
In the other, it is actually in plain sight.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I mean, I was wondering if you'd want to comment on that aspect. It's almost like you have to build these tall, imposing structures that are visible from a distance as almost like a massive act of reassurance.
Mm-hmm.
At a certain moment when, as you was rightly pointing out, there was extreme sense of vulnerability to foreign domination when India was facing a food crisis in the 60s between the droughts, the war, and a big question mark over whether the US would fulfill commitments to provide food aid or food subsidies. And so quite rightly, I think you link it to sovereignty. With the plinth, it's, as you say, perhaps optimizing more logistical concerns rather than these concerns of spectacular reassurance of a public or a citizenry. This one thought was to sort of comment on that. And the other one I'll mention as well is, what is how would you situate this in a kind of a rural, urban, or local, national continuum? Because you started with the famines, or going all the way back to Warren Hastings, but concurrently during that period, there was, especially in Eastern India and many other parts of India, a tradition of landlords maintaining grain stores.
Yeah.
And which played much the same role of both reassuring the people who lived in the estate, the cottagers, the tenants, the workers, the clients of the patron, but also maintaining the very practical problem of mitigating shortages, alleviating hunger, which was crucial, shall we say, to the moral economy within which law typically operated. So as we move from that kind of, shall we say, the rural organization of food storage for some of the same purposes you described with the modern nation state, to the sort of more urban locus of the citizenry that has to be fed, reassured, placated, kept from hunger, and so forth. What are some of the changes we see apart from scale? I mean, obviously landlords do it on a smaller scale because they're dealing with a smaller constituency. What are some of the other things we see? How does that distance between where the food is procured and where it has to serve this purpose of either managing markets or reassuring citizenry play?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So to start with the kind of story of the plinth, for me, when I kind of started thinking about it, that's another side of this story that I sort of didn't put into this talk today, is the idea of the body politic and the idea of grain standing in for the body within the body politic, and so when there are photographs of grain rotting, those are actually making a case for this dying body politic. And the kind of, we can locate the emergence of this body politic in the work of is the work of the kind of nationalist politics in the late, in the 30s and the 40s. And one that gets, so if you see some of the art coming out of the Bengal famine, I would say that, especially because that was coming from Marxist artists who were sort of aligning themselves with social realist traditions in Germany and in Russia, that they were critiquing this body politic, that it isn't the body politic that is, failing here, it is the body that is dying. But this imagination of, Mother India, the body politic, is so deeply connected to the idea of food, of farming, of starving, of within those, sort of lexicon of those sort of imaginaries, visual imaginaries. And so I think that, we think of the silo as something that can be seen from afar, but it can't be seen from all over. And when you photograph it, you cannot see the grain. And so the plinth does, it really embodies a different kind of monumentality, I would say. And a very ambivalent one at that, where there is a constant kind of attempt to further and further build silos. And what you see from the history of silo building is that these are very expensive pieces of infrastructure that aren't necessary. They actually don't do long-term work. They become useless very quickly. And so all of the silos currently being built are through public-private partnerships, on like rented, on these sort of long-term lease situations. So somewhere there, the plinth does visual work. And I don't know, I feel like it's a strange thing to say, but even the photos of them failing does work of reminding people of excess. Like what I found interesting about these images is it's always an image where the grain, sort of it's cut on all sides. The boundary of the image is always grain. You don't see the horizon or anything else. It's like this idea of like vastness, even in its failure. And so there's something about the plinth failing that is very much, I think, a kind of Indian imagination of the government, of the state, where you see the failures in a way. And that's why I also feel like that, that quoting of this farmer just misses, it doesn't understand the situation, doesn't understand what this person is saying. But then on this other question, I think that precisely the point is that the work that grain is doing in storage is different from the work that it does for Hastings, right? The problem is not the storage. The problem is that grain doesn't go into storage anymore. Grain goes into the market. There's no political, like you need political power to be able to take grain out of the market. And that's what's not there anymore. And I always found that story so strange, and how it's like, oh, the doors open inwards. And so this is like a design problem. This object has failed because it's a design failure. And it's not a design failure, it's a political economy that has a different moral calculus from the zamindar storage of sort of taking grain out of circulation for the future. And in that sense, what you're saying about this question of both scale, but also the spatial question of grain. I think that the issue there is somewhere between the idea of, so one of the questions that is being asked in mathematical terms is, where do you store the grain, right? And so that too has been kind of made into a mathematical issue. And so the one essay from, I think it was 1971, I forget the date now, but this is this linear programming model that's precisely asking this question that, okay, these are the regions of this state that have this much demand. These are the regions that have this much excess production, okay? These are the costs of storage and moving grain. If we give you these factors, can you model what is the best place to store grain in? Now, this is a kind of model that absolutely doesn't account for something like land acquisition. That doesn't account for the politics of who has power in terms of being able to actually prevent their land from being acquired, or from who has, or it doesn't even account for the fertility of land, or it doesn't account for irrigation patterns. It doesn't account for all of these things. And so this is, I think, where I started thinking about the economization of grain, that grain, you know, needs to serve a non-ontological purpose. And that's why, and you actually see this conflict between these two functions served by buffer stocks from the 1950s onwards, where people will say, well, you know, it'll help in managing prices, but it'll also be there as a reserve for, in case there's a shortage. And you see the same sort of argument being made about dams. Okay, so it'll be good for irrigation, but it'll also help us make power. Those are two contradictory functions. You cannot layer irrigation on top of power, because power requires higher height and irrigation requires water to be let out. And so they would just make the dams taller. But these would, so what I'm trying to say here is that eventually this stock just symbolizes these functions. It doesn't end up serving either any function. And this is, I think, the point that John Reyes was making, that they have no reason to actually release the stock. It will actually, you know, and Reyes was making it, I have seen people writing about it in the EPW in the 60s. You know, that, oh, it will create this huge inflationary pressure. So how do we then account for this grain that we're saying should go into storage without kind of creating a kind of, because where do we get this money from to purchase this grain? Should the RBI produce it? You know, from, if it does, then it'll lead to kind of inflationary pressures. And so on the architectural side, I think that, you know, a case can be made to see how you move from like silo to warehouse to just the storage becoming diagram more and more, because we think of grain as cash. Anyway, so that's my long story and long answer.
I had one other thought, and that had to do with, so if you look at that relationship with the farm gate to the consumer, including the consumer being the government, which is trying to create stocks and, with the FCI and so on, is that the plinth participates, in my lay imagination, architecturally in more aspects of this. What I mean is, you know, there's something like that flat and solid would be the grain merchant's storehouse. It would be the wholesale market floor, where large amounts of these things arrive and leave on a regular basis. It would, of course, as you showed us, also be part of a grand scheme of creating buffer stocks by a government agency.
Yeah.
It might be something you find in, you know, railway stockyards, and things are waiting to be moved here and there. So the plinth, to my mind, is far more integrated into the whole life of production and transaction and movement of large quantities of grain. And as you suggest, maintaining greater flexibility in any of those stages to respond to all kinds of developing situations. Whereas something large and enclosed and expensive to build, expensive to maintain, seems to be somewhat removed from those flows.
Yeah, and it also sort of inserts a kind of flexibility into how land is used and sort of borrowed, and so it's quite interesting, because what they call it the scientific plinth. because it has very, very clear kind of specifications for how high the plinth needs to be, how it needs to be waterproofed, what kind of this low density polyethylene sheet needs to cover it, and so on and so forth. And then how often, if it's in long-term storage, so there's pipeline stocks and buffer stocks, and so if it's in buffer storage, how you have to kind of insert pesticide into it to keep, and how you keep the temperatures at a certain level. You don't want to get too warm. You want to make sure the humidity is low. So the kind of propaganda around the plinth is very high, but also the shame around it is very high, where it's like, as soon as we can get rid of plinths, we need to get rid of plinths. And so that's a really interesting situation that I was also trying to kind of understand, that what is it about this plinth that is so that evokes so much sort of a kind of emotional response to it. I mean, I don't know if anyone tries to do any kind of work in these areas, you find it impossible. Like they like took my camera away and locked it in a closet, so that I could even visit the site. They were like, yeah, so this is, of course, a very sort of, it is a space of great tension.
Well, and building upon that, and maybe going a little bit further back, there's, especially with the importation of the silos from Kansas, it's at a moment when there's an incredible amount of land consolidation that's happening, especially in the north, where, right, you had many fractured lands where it's not a kind of continuous piece of land that a family would actually have. It was kind of like a mosaic. So that was seen as kind of a spatial problem to producing enough grain, or in certain parts of the country, as an impediment. And so consolidating that process seems to also be happening at the same time that the monumentality of the silos are happening. But there's also, in doing that, there's also at the same time a breakdown in terms of the kind of zamindar structure that's and a kind of almost sharecropping that's happening, especially in UP, Bihar, West Bengal. I mean, I'm curious if there's any tension in terms of the planning or the ministries with respect to these kind of spatial changes that are happening in terms of a political economy of land tenure rights, and then the modeling that's happening that you're talking about that doesn't even probably into the kind of use of cybernetics in the 70s, doesn't really probably account for any of that.
So, I mean, it was one of those things that I was looking for when I kind of went to this archive. That how would you find what it took to to develop this like very massive, and it's not completely decentralized, but it's somewhat decentralized, because warehousing is, a state portfolio. It's very, and as is land acquisition, and the food corporation kind of does a lot of the decision making. What I think is one of the things that happened is the food corporation, which is instituted in 1964, is conceived of as an executive body. It is separated out of the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. At that point, it was the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Now it's just the Ministry of Agriculture. And what happens is that they don't archive. And so there's a kind of in conceptualizing themselves as an executive body, a kind of arm of this ministry, there's this huge gap in the archive in terms of how they related with state warehousing or state agriculture ministries, in terms of how they because what you will end up finding is letters from the storage departments going out and just kind of constantly getting stuck. So this, I mean, we all know that this was not in any way easy. getting stuck in terms of, actually this is sort of aside from what you're saying, but the most hilarious exchanges were between the CPWD and the storage, because the CPWD didn't care. Like, what are you asking? Why are you asking us for all of these things? We're not going, like, at some point they would be like, oh, wait, you need cement to build your foundations for this silo that is your pet project. And they're like, we don't know how to build it. Sorry. And they're like, wait, we've been corresponding for 3 months and now you say this to us? So there definitely, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly where to go in terms of, I think your question is a sort of much bigger story about the ways in which Punjab gets transformed, because very much this is a Punjab story, right? The Green Revolution story, at least some aspect of it is very heavily Punjab dominated, but how kind of Punjab gets transformed from its situation of fragmented landholding tenures to this sort of very industrialized agricultural production, a kind of breakdown of labor relations, a kind of dispossession, the story of dispossession. That's the long history here, right, of the kind of extreme unequal development of this state under the aegis of the Food Corporation, the Ministry, and the Ford and, the Rockefeller Foundation, at least. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, yes, Punjab, because of its density, is the fastest to consolidate. And of course, UP, Bihar, and West Bengal take the longest.
Yeah.
It's usually the refrain that's given in terms of the central government archives.
I mean, so another sort of piece of this project is the work that Rockefeller did, in Punjab, and Rockefeller wasn't as sort of instrumental in Uttar Pradesh, but some of the work they did was, in making agricultural universities the center of how agricultural modernization sort of would find its links into, find ways to kind of enter into the countryside. And those two became these like massive architectural projects. So I think in terms of this question of scale, of space, what's sort of interesting in that regard too is the way in which they got consolidated, because they were always, early reports on agricultural education were supposed to be decentralized farming schools out in the countryside, and that's sort of was tried to be implemented in Uttar Pradesh. But then by the time you get to Punjab, it's like one central university in Ludhiana, one in Hisar, and extension. And the extension model is completely borrowed from the United States. So what's sort of fascinating here is that as much as the kind of United States and its Cold War, given the kind of pressures being put on India during the Cold War, was kept out of industry, in agriculture, they were really given a free hand because of the kind of lack of resources to put into agriculture. And so you really see the universities as points at which Rockefeller can kind of come in and really build an infrastructure of bringing in Green Revolution materials.
We are running out of time, Ateya, but we could be talking for much longer. I want to leave with a thought, not expecting you to answer it here. We have less than 3 minutes at this point, which is perhaps one day you'll also think about a whole suite of building projects that go into this, especially I'm reminded of this by your last remark about the division of responsibility between center and state in matters relating to agriculture, which is also a transferred subject. Land acquisition is a transferred subject. is the what state governments were also doing, especially the states which post-Green Revolution had really become surplus producers.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's agricultural marketing boards or loading docks or building road infrastructure, trucking. So and that comes with its own built forms and architecture once you have heavy road infrastructure with and so forth. So there's a range of building activity associated with basically the same question of food acquisitions, storage, movement, which then something like what the FCI is doing is one piece of a larger landscape. Maybe it's a very prominent piece, but it's one piece of a larger landscape.
Yeah.
Of very built forms that come to become important to and integral to the of managing food supply.
Yeah, and this is one of those, strange kind of things that happens in India, right? Where infrastructure gets divorced from public works, like those become two different things. And I think that's also one of the kind of things that dovetails into what you're saying, where infrastructure projects actually become a category of investment, whereas public works projects kind of become this story of redistribution or some sort of story of employment and all of these. And it's interesting because when you kind of tell the story to someone who comes from a kind of French or British context, they're like, no, infrastructure is just what public works became. But somehow that category, and I really think that has to do with its connection to famine. So I think the story of public works is very much a sort of story of this sort of post-independence famine imagination of the built environment.
Anthony, do you want to close the meeting?
Yes. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk and the conversation we got to have with you. I think I share Shivi's kind of question provocation in terms of a suite of buildings, which I suspect you have kind of an entire menagerie of those already archivally. So I'm really looking forward to seeing those being deployed. But thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It was wonderful to see.
Thank you. It was wonderful to talk to you.